Definitely. And I guess talking about it, let's kind of switch to polling what the state of the race is right now in the state. And so right now, with our overall polling aggregation, just looking at the public polls that are available, we do see Sanders ahead quite a bit. We did see sort of a pretty big drop in Joe Biden's vote share. And then again, at the bottom of the screen, we see that flat line by Bloomberg. And that's mostly, not mostly, entirely because he's not even running in the state. And so he's running that flat line, which we'll pay attention to a little bit more when we talk about the national polling. But right now, it seems to be Sanders is in the lead. But what sort of, to Alex Aldunson, what's sort of your take on the Nevada polling, and what are some of the difficulties, I guess, associated with it?
Well, so first of all, I'll start by saying I think it's pretty clear that Mitch McConnell's going to lose the caucus based off of this data. Um, but on a more serious note, I think Bernie at this point is expected to win, and so looking at the expectations game in New Hampshire, he was expected to win by 5 or more points, and it ended up being pretty close as the night went on. I think you'll see sort of a similar dynamic in terms of the expectation games here, where if he does end up winning by, I think it's fair to say he's expected to win by close to double digits, then he'll get that boost as anticipated. But if it does end up being a replay of New Hampshire, where second place, be that Biden or Buttigieg or someone else, come rather close to him, and in the delegate count it ends up being a wash, that might honestly hurt him at this point. So that's one of the things that I'm looking at is the top. Second thing I'm looking at is who comes in second. Is it Biden? If it's Biden, you could argue that his free fall is maybe ending, and the data that's coming out of South Carolina that shows him still winning, albeit by a small margin, maybe holds. And the sort of death of his campaign might have been a little premature. Um, or is it someone else? Buttigieg basically tied in Iowa, came in a close second in New Hampshire, so you could see him coming in second again. Warren had, I think, a good debate this week, and so does she bump up a few points and come in second, or is there some other surprise?
Yeah, it's also been interesting to see from the Warren numbers how associated with sort of her rise in the polls last summer going into autumn. She had a pretty staggering lead in Nevada, and I think the conventional wisdom that was the Warren campaign especially was focusing on Nevada as a way to, they were making assumptions about, well, she's probably going to do pretty well in New Hampshire, so then Nevada then becomes the next piece of capturing the media narrative. But her numbers on the screen right now have dipped pretty drastically. Do you think, I mean, as Alex, you were saying before, I think we're going to be paying attention a lot to especially the second, third, fourth place positions. If only, even if it doesn't translate into a big difference in delegates, if only to in how they possibly relate to the expectation game and other broader media narratives. But if you're, say, Elizabeth Warren, and I'm picking her campaign especially because of the great debate that she had earlier this week, at what point do you think it's a great night for, or a great afternoon for Warren? And at what point do you think, well, maybe we should start thinking about hanging up the hat of the campaign? And I'm interested in both your thoughts on that point for Warren's expectation.
One quick thought on that, though, is she's generally credited with having great debate, but that came after all that early voting was already in, and not knowing exactly what percentage of the final turnout that's going to be. I think you have to factor that into how you rate her and her performance. She might have expected a bigger bump had it happened the week before, or had there been no early voting, and see something more akin to the Klobuchar bounce that we saw in New Hampshire. It's just going to be hard to tell how to factor that in, how you price that into her performance because of 70,000 plus votes already having been cast before she ripped out Mike Bloomberg's bleeding heart and showed it to him on stage that night.
Now, I will say that, second through basically sixth place here in Nevada are close enough that even though she won't get the bump among early voters per se, I think she might be able to rise up a couple spots still. Kind of depends on how many votes are left. My gut tells me that we're about halfway through the votes at this point, but it can definitely make a difference. I
Halfway
think,
through would be a huge turnout. I mean, that would
yeah,
crush 2008.
yeah. I mean, the way I see it, right, is in the past it's always just been a one-day caucus. Essentially, now you have a caucus and you also have an option of more or less voting, the week before.
It's kind of like a
So
hybrid ranked choice
yeah,
voting primary kind of thing now.
yeah. On what sort of place it needs to be, I think Warren is the exception in that third place might still be a decent result for her. I think in general though, we're a week away, a week and a half away from Super Tuesday, which I think is going to set up the end game for the campaign. There's no there I don't think you're going to get much of a bump for third place anymore. I don't think that, even New Hampshire, for instance, Klobuchar comes in third, seems like a great deal. A week later, you know, I don't see much momentum coming out of that. So I think it's second place or bust for basically everyone that's behind Sanders, with the possible exception of Warren, just because she was completely lackluster in her results up until now.
One thing I would say about the bump, though, you're right. Klobuchar has these things where she gets, wow, she had a great debate. Wow, she did New Hampshire and doesn't show up nationally or anywhere else. She did raise a ton of money. And Elizabeth Warren, if she could parlay a third place into a lifeline of some money, would be a pretty big win, even if it doesn't necessarily instantaneously, start showing up in polling, because this is going to start happening so fast. And the problem with Super Tuesday is how many of those votes are already in the bank, especially in some of the larger states. But these candidates are really getting to the point where money is becoming as much of an issue as votes, but votes are an issue too. So it becomes this very negative feedback loop. If you can't produce one, you can't get the other. So I think she would be thrilled if she could get $12 million like Klobuchar did out of a third place finish and a good debate.
Yeah, I mean, ideally you have both. If you have money but you don't have momentum or a strong base, you're kind of just like a zombie campaign, running and running. You can run through Super Tuesday and maybe afterwards, but if you're not getting any delegates, the money's going to run out sooner or later.
But that may be what people are playing for, with this whole nobody's going to get 50%.
Well, yes, but you still have to get delegates, right? If you're coming in at 10% statewide, you're probably not getting any delegates, or maybe you're getting a couple at the congressional district level. But if you go into the convention with 50 delegates, you're not coming out of it with the nomination. So you still have to be able to at least compete.
Yeah,
now,
well, I was just going to pivot back to some of the numbers, and before we get to the point where we start talking about how Michelle Obama is going to win the nomination on the floor of the convention, let's also take a look at some of the national polling that we have as well, just to sort of, as we've been mentioning, what Nevada is going to say about the overall race. It is interesting to see the national polling, where we have a pretty different race here than even just a few weeks ago when we were talking, where we've had that Sanders surge up to first place, and then obviously, as everybody's talking about, the Bloomberg surge up to third place, although now people are sort of debating whether or not that has some staying power now after he's made his introduction to the debate. What do we think the effects of the Nevada caucus results are going to have on sort of the national picture?
So I think it's sort of a lagged effect. I think a lot of folks aren't paying too much attention to the race yet. And so, up until the week or two before they have to vote. And so, what you're seeing nationally is essentially a lagged picture of what you saw in some of the early states, especially if you sort of average them together. Buttigieg, for instance, as mentioned a little earlier, tied in Iowa, came in second in New Hampshire, but is barely cracking double digits in nationally. That's gone up. It hasn't gone up quite as much as it has in the early states. So I think the effect is essentially whittling down the field potentially. Although Nevada, this year it looks like maybe the candidates stay in, um, kind of as zombie campaigns, but moreover sort of informs later states as to which candidates really have a chance and they should be supporting them, and which candidates don't really stand much of a chance. And so you'll sort of, I think, see whatever happens in Nevada and South Carolina, those trend lines will probably start reflecting nationally. Whether that be, let's say a Warren bump in Nevada, you might see a resurgence of Warren nationally after the fact. Or if Buttigieg is able to continue his run, him looking more like a second or third place nationally kind of candidate. I think that's the main effect.
Right, and both of these pieces feature into the broader story, right? It's not just polling, as Drew was saying before. It's also money, and we could have this debate for the 15th time about endorsements and other factors.